Hi, today I'll be showing you how to take out the trash in the Scotch game, which appears after e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, and d4. E takes d4, knight takes d4, and the two main lines here would be knight f6 and bishop c5, which I showed in the other two videos. In this video, I'll be showing you the sidelines of this variation. The probably most common one here is bishop b4, and the idea is now after we play c3, our knight can't come to c3, which might be common in some variations. But if our opponent goes bishop c5, bishop e3, queen f6, trying to get a classical variation, which would appear maybe after bishop c5 on the fourth move instead of bishop b4. They would play bishop c5. And now when we play bishop b3, queen f6, this would basically be the position with bishop b4, except now it would be our move to play and we don't have a pawn on c3. So we would basically be up a tempo in the bishop b4 variation. Which is why after bishop b4, c3, bishop c5, bishop e3, queen f6. Queen f6 wouldn't be a good move at all. Now we can use our extra tempo to play g3. And now after g3, knight g7, bishop g2, castles and castles, we would have no problems with our position. If black tries to develop normally with maybe knight d6, we can play knight c2 to relieve the pressure on d4. And now if black takes, and we can take back with the knight, now our idea is to play f4, develop normally, and just have a game with a space advantage. So after bishop b4, the correct move after bishop c5 and bishop e3 would be to play bishop b6, which is the most common move after bishop c5 and bishop e3. So now we would play knight f5 to attack the g7 pawn, and also to take back on e3 if our opponent ever does. So like bishop takes e3, knight takes e3, and knight f6, and f3. Now we can get a position that kind of resembles the Maroczy bind. If we play c4 and knight c3, and it's probably going to be us with the better position here, because we would have a lot of control over the square in d5. We have a space advantage, of course, and we can just castle on the queen side and maybe launch an attack on the king side in the future. So now castles, c4 and d6. Now we play knight c3, knight d7 to, since from black's perspective this knight would not be useful. Black could try bishop e6, but the most common move here is to play knight d7, maybe to get the knight here and also get the queen here, or probably the best idea is to play knight c5 and then f5 to challenge our huge space advantage. We can play queen d2, and after knight c5, bishop e2, black would play f5, but we would just respond with take and castles. We can follow up with knight takes f5 and f4. So now let's go back to this position. And now instead of bishop b4, there's tons of other options. This one is particularly rare, but sometimes I see it online. It's kind of just a blunder, since like I guess the idea would be that after we take, they get their queen out, and then, I mean, like in this position, it'd probably be like maybe better for black. I'm not sure, but we don't have to do that. We can just first take on c6, and we already ruined their pawn structure. Now after e takes d5, black has two choices. This just drops the pawn immediately since we can just play bishop b5. And now after bishop d7, queen takes d5, rook b8, and we can just take, and take. We'll just be a pawn up, and now after castles, black's king is in the center, and we can just develop normally with knight c3, bishop anywhere honestly, and then we'll just move our rooks to the center. Now after d5, knight takes c6, takes, and then pawn takes. Black can also play queen takes d5. This is probably better than c takes d5, but we can just play queen e2, and after queen e6, knight c3, because if black takes on e2, we take with the bishop, and our bishop's gonna go to f3, targeting this really weak c6 pawn, and our other bishop can come to c4, and this pawn is also really weak. So instead of queen takes e2, black should play knight f6, and then bishop d2. Still, we're okay with the queen trade, but if black doesn't want to trade yet, we can just castle, and black's always going to have to deal with this weak pawn, no matter if it's in the endgame or not. And now after castles, queen takes, we finally released attention because we want to get our bishop out. Bishop takes e6 and bishop a6. A really nice move since now we're threatening bishop b7. It's probably the best square for a bishop anyways. The bishop on d3 would just target the h7 pawn, but it's not gonna end up amounting to anything. So now when we go back to knight takes d4, instead of d5, there's also queen f6, which would probably be like the second best move after bishop b4. Here we the most common moves here are just to go back, and also taking, and also bishop e3, which I don't think takes advantage of like this queen f6 move, which is slightly offbeat, and this allows black the chance to just transpose back to the classical variation. And honestly, I think black has pretty good chances in that variation, which is why instead of bishop e3, I would say knight b5 is one of the best moves. And after that, we can play bishop c5. The idea is that if we take, black will just play king d8. We can't take on a8 obviously because there's the threat of checkmate, which is why we just lose our knight here. We have to deal with this, and our knight's also being attacked. So after bishop c5, we just play queen e2. It's pretty common. And now after bishop b6, defending the pawn, we can just develop normally. And after knight e7, bishop e3. Bishop takes e3 is obviously not a good idea, since now not knight takes c7, since he can just play king d8. If we just take this now he'll just escape with the bishop. I'm not sure where, but let's just say a random square such as d4. And now oh no, actually we can play knight d4, which is a nice tactic. Now if white takes, we can just take on c2, and this would be a fork. And now obviously he can't take with the pawn, so the queen has to move somewhere else, but then that would just end up being checkmate on f2. And that's why we can't take on c7 immediately, but we can just take an e3, and black's idea with bishop takes e3 falls flat, since if you look at it, black only has two ways to defend this pawn, which is king d8 and queen e5. Queen e5 loses immediately since f4, and the queen has to move. We take the pawn on c7. The other option is king d8, but now we just castle, and it becomes pretty obvious that the king's in the middle. If you're even down a pawn here, we just play normally and we would have a better position. And now instead of these two moves, black could just play bishop a5, and now we would just castle and probably continue with f4, g4, and yeah. Now after knight takes d4, there's another move which is knight takes d4, and I feel like this is pretty common online, but it's not a good move, since queen f6 is the only move that doesn't just become losing for black. And now we can just play e5, and after queen b6, we can just take and ruin black's pawn structure. And now knight c3, and we can play knight d5, knight b5. So black has to prevent that with c6, but now this pawn becomes weak, and we can play bishop e3, which attacks it. And now after b5, we can castle. It would look like we're just blundering a pawn after b4, but we can play knight e4, and after rook takes a2, king b1, we have a lot of compensation because of this bishop on c8, which actually doesn't have a good way of getting out of its pawn cage. Black can't play d5 at any point, since we were just en passant, and b5 doesn't give any good squares for the bishop, at least not right away. So now the rook moves back to a5, attacking this pawn. f4, rook d5. We don't need to take this rook, we can instead play rook e1, and black's position is actually pretty stuck, because now we're threatening bishop c4, and the rook would have no other move but to just move back, and from there we could even play bishop b6, and it would just be a terrible position for black. So he needs to act quickly, and d6 is the computer's suggestion. I don't really see a reason for it, but then again, any other move would just run into bishop c4. Now we take on d6, and if black tries to get greedy with bishop takes d6, we have a really nice move here, which actually just wins. It's bishop d4. Now if the rook takes, we can take on d6, and the king couldn't keep protecting this pawn. King f8 loses to rook e8, which is why black has to move his king to the d file, and now after knight takes f7, he loses the rook, and probably wouldn't be able to even get the knight later. Instead, he can also move his knight like this, but we could just take, and then after that, knight f6. So after knight takes d4, queen takes d4, queen f6, like I said, was pretty much the only good option. Black could also try knight f6, which might look tempting at first. We shouldn't just act slowly with knight c3, although we would still be much better because of our lead in development. But instead we can play e5, and the knight doesn't have anywhere good to go, so he has to play c5. Now we can just move our queen to e3, and after knight d5, queen f3, knight c7, we can just play bishop c4. Now, after knight e6, we can just play knight c3, and we've developed 3 pieces which are way more active than this lonely knight on e6. Our knight maybe can come to e4, bishop e3, and then castles, which just shows how hopeless black's position is, since the only thing he can really do is just sit back. He can't develop this bishop, since we were just en passant and open the d-file with all sorts of nasty rook stuff. So obviously that knight f6 is not a good option for black. Instead, the main line here is to play knight e7, and a lot of people have fallen for a trick after bishop g5, which might look really tempting, since now the knight's pinned to the queen and black just doesn't have any other moves. But actually he can just play knight c6, and now after bishop takes d8, knight takes d8, we would be losing, since now our bishop has to move back, maybe take this pawn, but then you would just take this. Which is why after bishop takes, we can't play bishop takes d8, so we have to play queen d2, and now after bishop b4, we'll just play c3, but then he can play bishop e7, and most of our advantage is gone. As you can see, our knight can't move to c3, and it's not one of those variations where it's actually good for us. Which is why, instead of bishop g5, probably the most obvious move here is something such as bishop f4 or e3, but those aren't as good as it seems. Instead, I think bishop d2 is the best move, since now an interesting setup here is to play knight c3. If our queen gets attacked, we can move it back to e3, and now we can play f4, bishop d3, castles, and have a easy attack. And the difference from this would be shown later. From f4, bishop f4, or bishop e3 will be shown later, since after knight c6, queen e3, bishop e4, knight c3, d6, f4. Now, first of all, if our bishop was on f4, it would just be blocking f4, and the bishop's actually just better here on d2, since if the bishop was on maybe e3 or f4, it wouldn't actually be attacking anything or defending anything. But now that it's on d2, this knight's covered, and the queen on e3 is a big improvement over if we just moved our queen back to d2, since now the queen can maybe slide over to g3, and after f5, bishop h6 ideas could happen. So now after castles, bishop g4, we can play rook e1, and after king h8, probably wanting to play f5, we can just play h3. After bishop e6, g4, and we would have a devastating attack on the king side. We can also keep developing with bishop d3 and get a rook to the king side. Now another move after knight takes d4 would be d6, and after that we can just play bishop f4, and after knight f6, knight c3, bishop e7, queen d2. We have the position that I was saying, that if the bishop on d2 and the queen on d3 would be better, but here we didn't have the queen out yet, but it's still a really good setup for white, since now after castles, Black doesn't have any other counterplay other than trying to play d5. Now, if he just continued with a modest move such as bishop e6, well, I guess not bishop e6, maybe bishop d7, we can just continue with f3, g4, h4, and a devastating attack would ensue, definitely. So, instead of a passive move such as bishop d7, knight takes d4 would probably be the best move, and after queen takes d4, bishop e6, maybe like trying to start an attack with like a5, a4, but it's just slower than our attack. And now after f3, the same attack is shown here with g4, and yeah, it's not good for black. So yeah, that's the end of all the sidelines for the Scotch game, and I hope you learned something. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment, and I'll see you in the next video.